Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy podcast. I am your host, Roy Kessel, and today we are very excited to have with us Melissa Harper from Good Sports. Melissa, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
We're glad you're with us today to share more about the great work that you do in getting sports equipment distributed to kids. And I know we're going to spend a lot of time going through those mechanics, but before we get to that, give us a little bit of your background and how you got over to the concept of good sports.
Sure. Well, I grew up in upstate New York, and the first sport I ever played was Little League when I was 4 years old. My dad put a Little League hat on my head, and I have played sports ever since. And honestly, I have never met a sport I didn't like. So for me, sports have just been an integral part of my life. And to this day, they are still in my life and my children's lives. And so really, we founded Good Sports on the principle that sports shouldn't be reserved for those who can afford it. Sports are something that has an incredible benefit to children, regardless of their background. And the benefits of sports, academically, socially, emotionally, from a health perspective, shouldn't be for those who can afford to play. And so as the industry increasingly became a pay-to-play industry, and we were seeing kids from high poverty communities being left on the sidelines, we couldn't live with that. And we had to find a way that we could make a difference.
And when you look around right now, clearly that's still one of the big problems that sports has in the United States in terms of the cost of participation, the fees to play, not only the participation fees and not only the equipment, but all of the other costs that surround a child's ability to participate. When you look at the cost of the travel sports, a significant component of that is the amount of travel and family involvement that's needed. It's an ongoing problem, and when you look at Good Sports and where you fill in that role with the equipment, that's a significant benefit for so many of those kids. So tell us about the process of when you started Good Sports.
We founded Good Sports back in 2003, and really our first donation was 500 basketballs from Spalding when they were in Chicopee, Massachusetts, which is not too far from where we are, just outside of Boston. And we drove out and picked up 500 basketballs from Spalding and distributed them to a handful of organizations in the Boston area. Some of our earliest donations were basketballs and uniforms to a basketball program that was run by the Boston Housing Authority, where kids who were in high poverty housing environment had the opportunity to play because there was a committed person who was bringing that program to them in Greg Davis, but they didn't have the resources to be able to compete in the city tournaments and participate in the sort of broader leagues and programs that were available to them. So we donated balls to that program and a number of other programs in the Boston area, and then just continued to grow our footprint from there. So what started as a very grassroots, picking up basketballs in a U-Haul and storing them in mine and my co-founders' houses and garages has turned into a program where we've distributed over $55 million worth of equipment to 7 million kids across the country.
So that's an enormous amount of equipment. It's probably not going to fit in your garage anymore to
No.
to handle that process. I know that one of the challenges in this type of program is exactly that. When you talk about the logistical issues of how do you obtain all of the equipment, store all of the equipment. So why don't we go through that process? So when you are getting the opportunity to obtain equipment this comes primarily from manufacturers.
That's correct. Our business model is somewhat unique in the sense that we provide a service and a benefit to both the sporting goods industry and to the community that we serve. On the sporting goods industry side of things, just like any industry, there are always products that are left over from the end of a season, or that need to be moved because a license changes or a brand changes. There's lots of reasons that there's excess units in any given industry. And for the sporting goods industry, Good Sports is an outlet for that. So instead of product having to be sold on the discount market or destroyed and not really fully utilized, sporting goods companies donate that product to Good Sports because they know that we're getting it into the hands of the kids who need it most. And then on the community side of things, we work with community organizations, schools, youth programs, all operating in high poverty environments across the country. So that obviously impacts a lot of the major cities across the country, but also rural environments as well. There's poverty in rural Georgia that doesn't look that different from poverty that you see in an inner city LA. And so we really work with those organizations to understand what kind of youth programs are they offering. How is sport helping to change lives in those programs, and how can we get more equipment to those organizations so that they can grow, they can serve more kids, they can get kids off the waiting list, they can subsidize the fees. So essentially, more kids have the opportunity to play because of that equipment.
So the number you threw out originally was about $55 million that you've serviced over the course of time. And when you look around, I would imagine that that's only a small percentage of what the actual need is for these organizations. You know, throwing out a wild estimate, because I don't know that anybody's ever done a comprehensive analysis of what the true need is. If you were guessing, what on an annual basis, what percentage of the need that's out there do you feel like you're able to fill?
That's a difficult question because obviously that analysis has not been done, and it depends, it widely varies depending on the sport that you're offering and whether you're thinking about giving kids access to one sport, or are you talking about giving kids access to play in all sorts of environments. So I would say that number is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billion, on an annual basis, and that's really, like I said, driven by how much access are you trying to create? And in our case, we're really trying to bring play and sport to where kids are. So rather than trying to pull kids out of their communities and have them in travel programs and elite programs, we want to bring recreational sport and play back to the kids. So making sure that PE programs are well resourced and there's access to a variety of different sports in school, making sure that after school programs are available to kids, making sure that boys and girls clubs and community organizations are all able to offer affordable or free programming to give kids access to sport. So from our perspective, the more opportunities a kid has to play throughout their day, the better. And it doesn't have to be recreational or competitive. It can be a mix of both, but it should be all kids get a chance to participate regardless of their skill and regardless of their income.
Which brings up really one of the big challenges that I imagine that you face on a regular basis, which is how do you determine, with all of those needs, I imagine you get a huge number of applications and a huge number of organizations that all have rightful needs and legitimate needs for their kids in order to be able to play. And I imagine it's somewhat like all of us feel in terms of our donations to any types of charities and nonprofits, which is I see hundreds and hundreds of organizations out there I would love to support. Right. Unfortunately, our pocketbooks are not as big as our hearts in terms of what we can do. I imagine that's a similar situation for good sports. So take us through that process, what that looks like for organizations that are applying for equipment, and how you make those determinations when you've got 500 basketballs, but you probably know that you could distribute 10,000 basketballs. So how do
Mhm.
you go through that?
Well, we have a wide variety of criteria that we look at. We really try to understand the organizations that we're serving, and build relationships with them. But I would say, if you roll our application up into what's most important, there's a couple of things that really stand out. One is the need. We are in this business for the purpose of making sure that the most vulnerable populations of kids have access to sport. So we are very, very focused on making sure that the schools we're serving are high free and reduced lunch rate schools. The organizations we're serving are located in and serving communities that have poverty rates that are higher than the state average. So that need is really important. The other thing I would say, and this really comes through in the way that the rest of our application is completed, and also in the conversations that our program team is having on a daily basis with the community, but the quality of the leadership of the programs that we're serving, because you can really feel whether the leader of a community organization or a youth program, how they're approaching their programming with kids. Is it about winning the next state championship, or is it about making sure that those kids have access to sport and have more play opportunities and have more playing time, and they can get more kids on the field than they could yesterday, and it's fun, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what this is about. Play is the work of children. It's the way they learn, it's the way they grow. And so any type of sport or physical activity for kids has to be fun in order for it to be something that has a long-standing impact on their lives. So that quality of leadership, where we know that if we make that equipment donation, it's going to be used wisely, it's going to make a really big difference in a kid's life. That's what we're looking for when we're evaluating programs.
And how long is that process then? They've got to go through, you mentioned an application. How complicated of an application is that?
It's actually a fairly simple application, just a few pages, all online. You have to pull together a fair amount of data, but we're not asking them to write 10-page grants or long applications. What we're really trying to get to is sort of the key pieces of data that we need to understand their program. And that's very intentional, because the youth sports community is not a big, sophisticated, large institution community. It is coaches and athletic directors and volunteer parents that are running these different programs, and their time is strapped, their resources are limited, but their intentions are incredible. And so we want our application to be simple enough that it's not a big obstacle for them to submit, but at the same time collects enough data that we feel like the equipment that we donate is going to places where we know it's making a difference and having an impact.
And then tell me a little bit about what kind of follow-up there is, because you set those criteria in terms of the need and the leadership, and now somebody's submitted an application. Um, what is the process from once that application is submitted until you make I'll call it an award for lack of a better term?
So once an application is approved, it's essentially an approval of the organization for equipment donations. And then that basically establishes the relationship between Good Sports and that organization. And then we give them visibility into our inventory and what equipment we have available. And then they're eligible for up to 6 equipment donations over the course of a 2-year period before their approval expires and they have to resubmit. So during that 2-year period, we purposely do that because you get organizations that are multi-sport organizations. So we might might support them in the spring for their soccer program, but they might need support for their winter basketball league as well. And we want those organizations to be able to ask for equipment more than once. Once they receive an equipment, they'll submit an equipment request, and once they receive that equipment, they also have to fill out an evaluation that tells us what was the impact of that equipment. Did it allow them to get kids off the waiting list? Were they able to reduce their fees? What kind of difference did it make in the lives of the children that they're serving? And that has to be submitted each time they receive an equipment donation. And that's one of the things that we really hold the organizations to, because if they don't submit that, we can't tell our partners how their equipment benefited the community, and then they're less likely to donate to us. So the more data we have to share with our partners, the more resources we have to share with the community. So once that process is complete, they can come back and ask for more equipment for a future season, or for a different age group, or for other needs that they might have over that 2-year period.
So you've got to have some amazing stories coming out of those responses or surveys after they've got the equipment, having done that and impacted, as you said, 7 million kids through this program. Where do you see the most impact? In other words, when you get those responses from the organizations, what are the few areas that are most common in terms of what they're able to?
One of the biggest areas of impact that we see is the programs being able to fundamentally serve more kids. So the budgets of youth sports programs and even school budgets for PE are vastly under-resourced. And so what you see is organizations really living and running their programs year to year in a very bootstrapped way from a budgetary perspective. And so that leads to capacity constraints. So we recently supported an organization in Ohio that offers a football program to a community that is 50% of the population in that area is below the poverty line. So really, really needy community. Because they had so little equipment in their sort of available equipment, the kids were literally taping their football girdles with masking tape because they couldn't afford new girdles for any of the kids. We donated $12,000 worth of equipment to them that the manufacturing community had generously provided to us. And the coach of that program, the co-founder of that program, reached out and said that he had 30 more kids enroll because they had the resources to be able to provide that equipment. That those are 30 more kids that are off the streets. And in his words, it was, you just saved 30 kids' lives. And that's the way that they think about it, is if they can support kids in a positive, constructive environment like a sport, then they're keeping those kids from being in a difficult, crime-ridden environment that they might otherwise be drawn into. Roy, unfortunately, I can't hear you.
So when you get a coach that gives you a story like that, it really makes you think about the whole way that sports is set up in the US right now, because the cost of participation is so high. We've increased that over time to such an extent and priced so many families out with the whole travel sports. And I think what I found really interesting was your comment about the criteria you use, which is that quality of leadership, focusing on the ability to play and the ability to have fun, as opposed to the direct concept of competition, which is, the competition is inherent in sport, but I think sometimes we've sort of excluded the play and fun element of it. And it's disappointing, because just the wording of everything that we talk about in sports is we're going to play sports. but the play part has been taken out in so many different situations. Um, how do you see that over the course of time? You've been doing this now 17 years with Good Sport, and it's definitely changed, right? It's increased in terms of the level of competition and the price of participation. What are the biggest changes you've observed over that time period?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that the youth sports community is facing is that concept of recreational play is disappearing. So it used to be that in any city or town league, all the local kids would sign up for the local league and play together. And increasingly, what you're finding is that the elite travel and club type environments are pulling the most talented kids away from the recreational leagues, and that's leaving the recreational leagues really under resourced and also with a lack of participation. They don't have enough kids to field the number of teams to be able to make a recreational league function effectively. And so what then happens is you get that next level of kids, that all start to get pulled out into travel or club programs. And then you're left with the kids who can't afford it. And that's in communities where income levels are stratified, right? In communities where the poverty rate is dominant and the majority of the kids can't afford it, those travel and club leagues don't even exist, right? They don't have the opportunity to participate in those. So you create these environments where there's just a lack of sport, a lack of competition, a lack of access. I think what we have to get back to is a situation where sport is about play and fun. That's the purpose of it. And regardless of the level of competition that you have, as long as that competition is appropriate for that child, there should be a place for everyone to play. And that's why school sports are so important, both at the PE level, so trying different sports, and then also at the more competitive level for kids who that is a good experience for them. But that's also why Boys and Girls Club, town leagues, community centers, recreational leagues all need to be protected and supported, because every kid needs a chance to play, not just those who have the skill.
And I think you really touched on a critical point there is giving every kid a chance to play. One of the biggest problems that I see in the whole travel sports space is that we're making decisions very early on in a child's athletic career as to whether they're quote unquote good, um, and how good they're going to be. And the whole concept of travel sports has really, I think, been borne out not only of wanting a better level of competition just for the sake of play and competition, but I think many of us would agree that it's out of a somewhat misguided notion that putting your kid in a travel sports program is somehow going to get them a better opportunity to play college or professional sports just because they played travel baseball or soccer when they were 10, 11, 12 years old. And the data really doesn't support that the kids that get to that next level have necessarily all been playing the travel sports from such an early age. We see kids maturing at different types of ages and stages. I think one of the best comments I heard last year was Tim Shriver from Special Olympics talking about the fact that sports is really one of the only domains in our country where we look at somebody at maybe a second grade level and then try to extrapolate how good they're going to be for the future, and then not only classify them as such, but basically have them stop playing a sport because they're not good enough at soccer or they're not good enough at basketball. And he used the analogy of walking up to somebody and saying, Melissa, you're just not very good at English. So we're just going to stop teaching you English in second grade because you haven't shown the proficiency. Right, you're not good with numbers, so we're going to stop teaching you math. You need to find something else to do and learn because that's not going to be your future. We would all scoff at that and talk about how ridiculous that is as a notion, but functionally, that's really what we're doing with a lot of the travel sports opportunities. We're taking kids and we're taking the best kids out. I know my son was playing soccer, and because he didn't start travel 2 years earlier, meaning at like 8 years old, he didn't start travel. By the time he was 10 years old, he was sort of behind all of these other kids. And you talk about not only the cost and resources for the house leagues or the community recreation leagues, but you've also taken all of the talent out of those leagues. And so what you've done is not given the kids in that secondary tier or mid tier something to aspire to in terms of how good they need to do, and watching the habits, the training habits, the work ethic that maybe some of those kids who were more advanced at an earlier age developed some skills, developed some habits that would really be good from a leadership perspective. And we're putting everybody in this elite level where they're, I think the term that Tom Ferry from Aspen Institute uses is over professionalized at such an early age, where they're spending so many hours a week on their sport from the age of 10 that by the time they even get to high school, many of these kids are burnt out from the number of hours, because it's not play, as you said.
Mhm.
It's work.
Your analogy to education and sort of continuing to teach kids where regardless of their proficiency is a good one, in the sense that what's happening in sport is a little bit counter to what is happening in education. So in education, you're seeing a movement toward integrated classrooms where kids with different level of ability and level of need for academic support are becoming increasingly integrated, right? There's classrooms where there's kids who are on the spectrum or qualify for IEPs or special education that are integrated with kids who are considered peer learners, and are role models, and basically serve as a way to integrate two different types of learners so that they can both learn better. And in youth sports, you're seeing just the opposite. We are pulling apart kids based on talent and skill and ability and separating them. And that puts limitations on both groups, because the kids who are talented don't learn this sort of same quality of teamwork and ability, and having to teach and work with other peers in different ways. And the kids who are learning the sport don't have someone that they can model. And so our society across the board, no matter what area you're talking about, is better when people who are different work together and use their strengths. And that's where we're seeing sports kind of fall behind as far as the quality of the experience, and it becomes not fun, like we said. And that's the number one reason that kids drop out of sports, is because it's no longer fun.
I also think you touched on a really important point there about the fact that the kids that are better are not learning perhaps some of the concepts of leadership, of sportsmanship, of teamwork, because they're not having to deal with a teammate who made a mistake or a teammate who was worse than they are. That's a different set of skills. And I think that it's something that's important to learn, because as you move up that proverbial food chain of sports, right, you're not always going to be the star. You might be the star on your U10 recreational league at the park district, but now when you go up to a travel league, that's a big jump. And then when you go up to high school, right, or college, or right, you're going up and up and up. It's very few people are going to remain the elite player and the star all the way through. And it's something that's important to learn. I think one of the biggest strengths of sports is what it teaches you outside of the competition. All of that teamwork, all of that leadership ability, all of that collaboration. It's why athletes in a lot of the studies, people that played many sports and competitive sports, often function much better in the workplace and in that environment, because they've had those opportunities. They've seen that. They understand that life isn't always fair, right? The ball takes a bad bounce, a ref makes a bad call, somebody slips and falls, somebody misses an easy shot, right? It's just part of what we go through in competition and in life, and it's no different in business. I'm sure that there's many times that we all look at what goes on in our own organizations, and I've probably pulled out more of my hair. You're fortunately doing a much better job leading, since you've still got uh, everything there. But right, we all look at what goes on, and we understand that something happened, and at times we'll get frustrated, and part of what sports teaches you is the ability to overcome those frustrations and really build off of that. um, I think one of the areas we haven't touched on much is the process of how you go and get the equipment. You talked about, in general sense, um, a lot of it's from the sporting good manufacturers and what they've got left over in inventory, or we'll call it obsolete items for branding or sponsorship type of purposes, where something is now out of license, or things like that. But as as you've built this up since you launched in 2003, what's the process look like of how you try and cultivate that? And more importantly, for our network, what can we do to help in that process? Because we've got a lot of people that we all interact with that are in different parts of the sports business and sports business world. Tell us about what we can do that helps get equipment to you.
So the relationships with the sporting goods industry have really evolved from that early days when 500 basketballs was a big deal, to a point where Good Sports is kind of a go-to partner for the sporting goods industry when it comes to excess product. But at the same time, our relationships have developed enough that now sporting goods companies are not just looking at Good Sports as a way to offload excess product, but they're also looking at us as a partner to help close the participation gap and make sure that greater number of kids, that kids from all different kinds of backgrounds have access to play. And so, in light of what's been going on with the COVID-19 crisis, one of the things that Good Sports is really focused on right now is restoring play as quickly as possible for the communities that we serve. The last 3 months have really paused play for kids across the country. There's very little that they can do in terms of participation in sports when everyone is homebound and social distancing is in place. And so what we're doing is, again, meeting kids where they are. So we're distributing equipment with some of our manufacturing partners. We're distributing equipment with school meal programs, with food banks, in places where families are being supported during this crisis, and we can bring play to the kids at home. So if you give a jump rope, a ball, a piece of equipment that the kid can use at home, their coach has an opportunity to run Zoom calls and run Zoom practices and send them daily workouts and give them fun competitions to do with their teammates. So suddenly play can come into the house with them versus just being stalled. And it gives those coaches and community organizations an opportunity to stay connected to their kids. And staying connected to kids during this time of crisis is incredibly important, because those coaches and those community organizations often have a really instrumental instrumental role in the kids' lives. And not having that can be very dangerous. And so maintaining those connections and making sure that kids can play at home is one of the big ways that we're tackling the COVID-19 crisis.
Yeah, it's very difficult right now to know how this is going to emerge from the crisis. I think nobody would have anticipated 3 months ago, if I sat here on March 4th and told you what was going to happen over the next 3 months, it would have been impossible to envision. We would have all scoffed at the notion that all of sports and almost all of society is going to shut down and we're all going to be locked in. And now, uh, with the warmer weather and a little bit better handle on the transmission process and a little bit more PPE equipment, um, people are willing to go out a little bit more than they were. They're still mostly taking precautions. It's going to be hard to see as sports resume. I think, unfortunately, I hope we don't get an overreaction again, because when you put people together, there will be some individuals that get sick. There will be people that contract COVID-19, which unfortunately means there will be a certain percentage that will have complications and pass away. That just the data will show that those are the numbers. I think the risks might be lower for the kids, but all of these kids come from homes where they have parents or grandparents that they're around and interact with. The coaches may have families that are part of that, so other people around the production of the sporting events will have those same types of issues. Um, I think that sports is such an important outlet for kids to get that activity. We see that the data shows us that only 26% of the kids are getting the recommended amount of activity in the first place, right? Even before the COVID crisis. And now this is going to have that chilling effect of some families not wanting to participate or not participating as extensively as they have before. And there have been some incredibly innovative tools that have been developed and resources to engage kids remotely, but at a certain point, right, engaging us like this on a flat Zoom call is not what a young Roy at 8 or 10 or 14 years old would have put up with, right? I want to be outside running around and playing with a team and being with people. And sure, I can sit at home and practice certain types of things and drills. And I think we all did plenty of that when we were young. But it's going to be challenging when we get what I call that first setback. When you get that first tournament or first set of things that are going on, and then there is an outbreak. And I hope that that doesn't mean that everything gets shut down again. I hope that it doesn't become widespread enough that everything has to shut down. I think when we did in March, it had to, because nobody understood enough about it. I'm hoping now that we understand more and that the systems are further developed so that we can uh, continue to engage the kids and get them active, because it is so important for them to be out there. Um, I
I
know,
think that
Melissa, you've done a great job with getting so much of that equipment together. Look ahead for me for the next few years. What do you see on the horizon as some of your biggest goals and challenges?
Well, I think in the immediate future, we are going to see demand like we've never seen before for equipment, because on the heels of the COVID-19 crisis, when youth sports organizations rebound and schools reopen, budgets are going to be smaller and tighter than they've ever been. And so programs are going to have fewer and fewer resources to work with. And in most cases, the programs we've been serving already had few resources to begin with. So the demand is going to be incredible. And there's also going to be an intolerance for sharing equipment. Right now, you can have a girls' softball program with 2 helmets and the kids all wear the same helmets, right? That's not going to be the way that sports are going to operate when this is over. They're going to want every kid to have their own helmet, every kid to have their own ball, and minimize sharing of equipment as much as possible. And in high poverty communities, that is going to be astronomically difficult from a cost perspective. And so that's really where we see a tremendous amount of demand coming. And that's where we're really approaching the sporting goods community as well as the sports philanthropy community, and asking for support to help us restore play for the kids who need it most, because they're going to need the benefits of sport more than they ever have. But access is going to be harder to come by because of the astounding cost that's going to be faced.
Well, I congratulate you on the great work that you've done in order to give you even more strength and power. We want to use our sports philanthropy superpowers now, and we want to give you the opportunity to be anointed as a commissioner of one of the sports. And so tell us what sport that would be.
I think I would probably go with Major League Baseball, because my hope is that that's the sport that's going to come back the soonest, and so I would like to be able to use the platform to do something right away.
So as commissioner of Major League Baseball, then it's always interesting as fans. We watch sports a lot. We look at all kinds of things. Give us one rule you'd like to see changed in baseball.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I wouldn't necessarily point to a specific rule, but I would say that I think the most important thing for baseball to do is to make the game move faster. And I don't say that because of the annoyance that fans sometimes find because of a 3 or 4 hour baseball game. It's more actually at the youth level. Um, Baseball needs to keep the game moving so that kids stay engaged. I think kids get bored after a while, and that's really what I think, why I think baseball needs to change. And then I think in the broader scale, broader sort of scope of professional sports, I think that as a commissioner of a major league sport, I would really use my platform to make sure it's clear that sports have the opportunity to change lives. And particularly right now, when we're seeing such sort of racism and social unrest going on in the world, it's important to know that sports have the opportunity to break down those barriers. When kids play on a team together, it changes everything about how they think about another person, regardless of their skin color. And I think that that's really important, that if we can make sure that sports are available to all kids in all of their environments, and make sure that sports are integrated, and kids who look different and play different and learn different are all integrated in the same sports teams, we will be able to move the needle on the racism that we see in this country.
Well, I think those are great points. I know that sports does a great job breaking down barriers, because when you sit there and you interact with people directly and you compete with them, you stop putting them in groups. Vic Fangio came out recently and said, it's a meritocracy in the NFL and there's no racism. And then he got a lot of flack and he kind of backed off his statements. But he said, what I'm really saying is that on the field, in the locker room, right, it's not based on race. If you can produce, we're going to have you playing on the field, because all I care about as a coach is, am I going to win football games? I don't really care what anything else is in terms of race or religion or anything else. Now, it might be a little bit idealistic, but I do believe for the most part that that's true. Like pure, on the field X and O's, that is probably about as blind as you're going to get to the race issues. But everywhere else around the sport, in the front office, in media, in all kinds of other areas, those issues still abound. So Melissa, I want to thank you for coming on with us today. It was fantastic to learn more about good sports. I hope that our group will support you and continue to expand on what you're doing. We'll put all of your social media accounts and everything on the page. So if you're watching and listening to this, you can see all of the information about Good Sports, links to their website, and we look forward to having you support their efforts. Thank you very much, Melissa.
Thanks so much.
And thank you to our listeners for being with us. We hope you'll join us for the next edition of the Sports Philanthropy podcast.